The firelight here is deceiving, casting long, wavering shadows against the rough-hewn stone walls, mimicking the movement of men who are no longer there, while the air in this high vaulted chamber feels thin and biting, carrying the distinct, sharp scent of old parchment and the metallic tang of iron left out in the frost. Outside, the wind scours the plains of northern France, a low and constant moan that pushes against the heavy shutters, but inside, the only sound is the rhythmic scratching friction of a quill moving across vellum and the occasional settling of a log in the hearth, sending up a flurry of sparks that fade before they hit the flagstones. We imagine this change happened suddenly, that the great shift from the age of chivalric glory to the cold machinery of state survival arrived with the crash of a cannon or the cheer of a victorious army, feeling like a single moment where the world turned over. But the truth is slower, quieter, and far more unsettling, arriving not with a shout, but with the quiet accumulation of debt, the subtle erosion of wealth, and the creeping realization that winning a kingdom might actually be more dangerous than losing one. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We find ourselves in the immediate aftermath of what history will call the high water mark of English power, standing in the shadow of the year 1415, where the mud of Agincourt has finally dried and the dead have been buried, leaving King Henry VI the master of a field that stunned Europe. It seems like the perfect ending to a story, the moment where the hero sheathes his sword and the credits roll. Yet in the dimly lit council chambers of London and the draughty occupation halls of Normandy, the mood is not one of jubilation, but of a heavy, suffocating calculation. The victory was brilliant, yes, a tactical masterpiece that historians still argue over, debating whether it was the longbow's reach or the heavy French clay that truly decided the day, but the cost of that brilliance is beginning to settle like dust in the lungs of the English treasury. War, until this point, had often been a seasonal affair, a violent summer storm that broke and receded, allowing men to return to their harvest and kings to their hunting. But Henry has begun something different here, something permanent. He does not just want to raid, he wants to hold, and to hold a country that does not wish to be held requires a constant stream of silver that flows only in one direction, out. Imagine the sheer weight of it, not the weight of plate armor or heavy lances, but the crushing gravity of logistics. Thousands of soldiers who do not go home when the leaves fall, garrisons that must be fed through the lean winter months, and stone walls that must be repaired after every siege. The king is finding that while a battle can be won in an afternoon, a conquest must be purchased every single morning over and over again. The ledger on the table before us is open, and the columns of numbers are terrifyingly long, detailing expenses for bread, for arrows, for the wages of archers who know their worth, and for the transport of horses across the unpredictable grey chop of the Channel. It is here, in the quiet scratching of the clerk's pen, that the true nature of this war reveals itself, for the English crown has walked into a golden trap, a victory so complete that it demands an investment they cannot sustain. The captured castles are damp and draughty, sitting like islands in a hostile sea of French countryside, and every one of them requires a captain, a chaplain, a cook, and 50 men who expect to be paid in coin, not promises. The illusion of wealth provided by ransoms and looted baggage trains fades within months, eaten up by the mundane reality of feeding an army that has stopped moving. Perhaps this is why the atmosphere feels so tense, even in the glow of triumph, because the men in charge of the coin chests know what the knights do not, that the bottom of the chest is visible. The English Parliament, gathered far away in the echoing halls of Westminster, is already weary of the king's requests, their enthusiasm for glory tempered by the pinching of their own purses, for they know that taxes are the fuel of this engine, and the engine is hungry. We see the king himself, not as the shouting warrior on the muddy field, but as a tired administrator sitting by a dying fire, rubbing his temples as he reads reports of localized rebellions and supply ships lost to storms. He has mortgaged the future to pay for the present, pawning the crown jewels, borrowing from wealthy merchants, and promising revenues that have not yet been collected, creating a fragile web of credit that spans the narrow sea. It is a gamble of breathtaking scale, betting that the wealth of France will eventually pay for the conquest of France, a circular logic that makes perfect sense in a poem but rarely works in a counting house. The French, for their part, are battered and bleeding, their nobility decimated and their king slipping into madness. Yet the land itself endures, vast and absorbing, a sponge that soaks up English resources without ever truly drying out. The winter air feels heavier now, laden with the smoke of wood fires from 1,000 villages where the peasants are trying to hide their grain from the tax collectors of both sides. It is a time of deep uncertainty, where the boundaries of the map are drawn in ink, but maintained in blood and silver. We notice, too, the subtle shift in how the soldiers carry themselves. They are no longer just feudal levies fulfilling a duty to their lord, but professionals, mercenaries in all but name, men who fight for a contract and who will lay down their tools if the wages are late. This shift changes the very texture of the conflict, turning it from a clash of ideals into a transaction, a business where the margins are razor thin and the penalty for bankruptcy is death. The silence in the room deepens as the clerk dips his quill again, the black ink glistening like oil in the firelight, recording another loan, another debt, another promise that pushes the reckoning further down the timeline. There is a sense of drifting here, a feeling that the ship of state has sailed into waters too deep for its anchors to hold, carried along by a current of ambition that is stronger than the wind. The stone walls seem to lean in, listening to the secrets of the deficit, knowing that stone lasts longer than gold. We feel the cold seeping up through the floorboards, a reminder that nature does not care for the claims of kings, that the seasons will turn regardless of who holds the castle, and that hunger is the only enemy that cannot be defeated with a longbow. The myth of the glorious conquest begins to fray at the edges, revealing the raw, expensive threads beneath, and we realize that the war has transformed into something monstrous, a living thing that eats money and breathes out poverty. The victory at Agincourt was loud, a thunderclap that shook the world. But the defeat that is forming now is quiet, gathering in the shadows of the treasury, hidden in the complex arithmetic of interest and loans. It is the beginning of a long, slow exhaustion, a draining of the spirit and the coffers that will take decades to fully play out. But the seeds are sown here, in this drafty room, under the watchful gaze of a king who has won everything except the means to keep it. The fire pops, a sudden sharp sound in the stillness, and for a moment the shadows jump, looking like grasping hands reaching for the coins that are no longer there, and as the wind howls outside, rattling the iron hinges of the heavy oak door, we get the distinct, unsettling sensation that the trap has already snapped shut, though no one has yet heard the click. The rain that falls on Normandy during these long occupation years feels different from the sharp cleansing showers of the English spring, descending instead as a relentless, soaking grey mist that clings to the limestone walls and seeps into the very marrow of the men left behind to hold them. We drift through the heavy oak gates of a newly captured citadel, perhaps Caen or Harfleur, where the adrenaline of the siege has long since evaporated, replaced by the dull, aching routine of ownership, and we find that the prize so fiercely won is actually a burden of crushing weight. The stone is cold to the touch, sweating moisture in the changing season, and every drop of water that works its way into a crack in the masonry represents a future cost, a bill that will eventually come due in the form of masons, mortar, and timber. It is a slow realization, creeping up on the victors like the moss that claims the north face of the keep, that the true enemy is no longer the French army, which has scattered into the mists, but the castle itself. We watch a garrison captain standing on the battlements, pulling his cloak tighter against the wind, looking out over a landscape that is technically his to command, yet feels utterly alien and resistant. He is tired, not from fighting, but from counting, for his days are consumed by the mathematics of survival. How many bushels of wheat are in the granary? How many barrels of salted herring remain before the next supply cog arrives from Southampton? And how many of his archers have deserted in the night because their wages are 3 months in arrears? The glory of Agincourt feels like a distant memory here, a story told by firelight that grows harder to believe with each passing week of mud and boredom. The reality of occupation is a ledger of expenses that never ends, a list of demands that would make a rich man weep. We see the sheer scale of the infrastructure required to turn a foreign fortress into an English stronghold, the thousands of nails that must be forged, the ropes that rot in the damp air, the endless demand for firewood to keep the damp from destroying the bowstrings. It seems that for every silver coin the English crown squeezes out of the conquered territory, 2 must be spent just to keep the roof from falling in. Historians have long debated the precise economic tipping point of this occupation, with some arguing that Henry's administration in Normandy was surprisingly efficient, almost modern in its rigorous record-keeping, while others suggest it was a financial black hole from the very start, masked only by the sheer force of the king's will. Regardless of the academic consensus, the lived experience in these drafty halls is one of constant, low-level anxiety. We listen to the scratch of the quill in the castle steward's room, a sound that rivals the wind outside for persistence. He is riding to the exchequer, pleading for funds to repair the drawbridge mechanism which has rusted seized, or to pay the local carters who refuse to haul grain without silver up front. The credit of the conqueror is stretching thin, frayed by the distance across the channel. We notice, too, the subtle change in the relationship between the soldiers and the land. They are no longer raiders passing through, taking what they need and leaving smoke in their wake, but rather landlords who must preserve the very peasants they once harried, for if the peasants cannot harvest, the garrison cannot eat. It is a strange and uncomfortable intimacy, a forced marriage between the occupier and the occupied, where resentment simmers just below the surface of every transaction. The English soldier, shivering in his woolens, looks at the sullen French baker and realizes that his survival depends on this man's flour, just as the baker realizes his safety depends on the soldier's pike. In the courtyards, the silence is broken only by the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, repairing the ironwork that the humidity is determined to destroy. Iron, like silver, is a fugitive resource here, rusting away or disappearing into the pockets of opportunists. The Crown is forced to ship basic materials across the sea, paying for the transport of items that should be abundant, a logistical absurdity that adds layers of cost to every horseshoe and hinge. We feel the weight of the stone pressing down, the sheer mass of these castles that were built to withstand sieges, but are now falling victim to the slow attrition of neglect and lack of funds. The king in London, or Rouen, sees the map painted in his colours, a wash of red spreading across the north of France, but he cannot feel the draught in the solar or smell the mould in the storeroom. He deals in sovereignty, while his captains deal in rot. There is a profound irony in this, one that drifts through the centuries like wood smoke. The more land England captures, the poorer it becomes. The wealth of France, so legendary in the songs of the troubadours, turns out to be tied to the land and the people, difficult to extract and easy to destroy. To tax a village, you must first protect it from bandits, from wolves, and from your own unpaid mercenaries who might decide to loot it for their wages. The cost of protection eats the profits of taxation, leaving the treasury with a handful of copper coins and a mountain of administrative paperwork. We see a clerk pausing to rub his eyes, the candlelight flickering on the uneven table, his fingers stained with ink and cold. He is one of the unsung casualties of this war, a man fighting a battle against insolvency that can never truly be won. He knows that the indentures of war, the contracts binding captains to the king, are precise legal instruments, specifying exactly how much a man-at-arms is owed per day, usually 1 shilling, and an archer 6pence. These are not vague promises. They are legal debts, accumulating interest and resentment with every setting sun. If the king cannot pay, the captain must pay from his own pocket or risk a mutiny, and many a noble English family is quietly ruining itself in these damp French castles, selling off ancestral woods in immense swathes back home to fund the honour of holding a tower in Normandy that no one truly wants. The landscape outside is darkening now, the twilight turning the grey rain into a deep, impenetrable blue. The walls of the castle seem to loom larger in the gloom, their silhouette a jagged tear in the horizon. We get the sense that the stone is patient, far more patient than the men who claim to own it. The castle has seen Vikings, Franks, Normans, and now the English. It knows that owners are temporary, fleeting shadows that pass through its halls, while the damp and the gravity remain. There is a gentle, almost humorous absurdity in the sight of a burly English sentry trying to communicate with a local washerwoman, their breath steaming in the cold air, haggling over the price of clean linen in a mixture of broken French and grunted English, a tiny human moment that underscores the vast, expensive mess of it all. The conquest is not a thunderous epic of heroes. It is a series of these small, expensive interactions, repeated 1,000,000 times over vast distances. As the night fully descends, settling over the stone like a heavy blanket, the weight of the occupation feels physical, a pressure in the chest. The gold that was won at Agincourt has been spent 10 times over, poured into the mortar of these walls, and still the walls demand more. The wind picks up, whistling through the arrow slits, singing a lonely song of attrition, and we drift away from the castle, leaving the captain to his worries and the clerk to his ledger, knowing that tomorrow will bring only more rain, more rust, and more bills that cannot be paid, as the great stone beast continues to eat the wealth of a kingdom, 1 silver penny at a time. The silence that descends upon the Château de Vincennes in the late summer of 1422 is heavy, suffocating, and smells faintly of vinegar and stale incense, the traditional masking scents of a sick room where even the most powerful man in Europe cannot command his own body to heal. We drift through the corridors of this royal residence just outside Paris, where the air is thick with a terrified anticipation. For the unthinkable has happened. The warrior king, Henry V, the architect of Agincourt, and the man who was supposed to unite the 2 crowns, has died not by the sword, but by the slow, humiliating ravages of dysentery. It seems like a cruel joke of biology, that a man who survived the arrow storms of the battlefield and the crushing melees of hand-to-hand combat should be undone by bad water and camp fever, shrinking away in a sweaty bed while his armies wait for orders that will never come. The shock of this moment radiates outward like a crack in a frozen lake, silent at first, but threatening to swallow everything, because the king was the keystone, the single point of tension holding the entire arch of conquest together. Without him, the physics of the war change instantly. We move from the deathbed to a nursery, perhaps in Windsor or a secure fortress, to look at what remains, a baby, Henry VI, who is barely 9 months old. It is an image of profound, almost comedic absurdity. The entire weight of the Plantagenet ambition, the claims to the throne of France, the massive loans, the garrisons and the treaties, all descending upon a child who is more interested in the texture of his blanket than the geography of Europe. We imagine the crown being brought near him, the heavy gold circlet encrusted with rubies and sapphires, and the sheer physical disparity is terrifying. The object could crush his skull, just as the political reality threatens to crush his kingdom. There is a specific quiet panic among the courtiers and councillors, the men who now have to govern in the name of an infant. They know, as they look at the sleeping baby, that a minority rule, a period where the king is a child, is the most dangerous time for any medieval state, a vacuum where ambition grows like mould in the dark. But the true horror, the one whispered about in the counting houses of London, is not just the king's age, but his inheritance. Henry V has left his son the most glorious title in history, but he has also left him completely, utterly broke. The executors of the king's will, men who loved him and served him, take one look in at the personal debts he accrued to fund his wars, and in a move that stuns the legal world, they refuse to administer the estate. It is a moment of stark financial realism that pierces the veil of chivalry. The king died owing so much money to so many people, merchants, knights, foreign bankers, that his own friends cannot afford to clean up the mess. The glory of England is, on paper, an insolvent enterprise. We watch as the funeral procession begins its long, slow march back to England, a river of black velvet and flickering torches moving through the French countryside. It is a spectacle of mourning, yes, but also of immense cost. The funeral effigy is made of boiled leather and wood, dressed in robes that cost more than a village earns in a year, and the wax for the thousands of candles burning around the hearse is a fortune in itself. Even in death, Henry IV is expensive. The procession moves like a dark scar across the land, and as it passes, the French peasants watch from the fields, perhaps sensing that the iron grip of the English is loosening, for a dead king cannot ride and a baby cannot rule. Historians still debate whether the English project in France was doomed the moment Henry closed his eyes, arguing over whether any other hand could have held the disparate pieces together. But in the immediate aftermath, the feeling is not one of doom, but of a frantic, improvised stabilisation. The king's brothers, the Dukes of Bedford and Gloucester, step into the light, two men of immense capability who must now share the burden of the regency. Bedford, the elder, takes France. Gloucester, the younger and more volatile, takes England. We see them meeting in low-lit rooms, spreading out the maps that their brother drew, trying to understand how to maintain the momentum of a conquest that ran on the sheer force of a personality that is no longer there. They are like mariners trying to sail a ship through a hurricane after the captain has been washed overboard, gripping the wheel with white knuckles. The treasury is empty, the soldiers are demanding their arrears, and the French Dauphin, the disinherited Charles, is still out there, lurking in the south, waiting. The atmosphere in London shifts from the aggressive, forward-leaning posture of the last decade to a defensive crouch. The questions in Parliament change from how much do you need to win to how much do we owe. The metaphor of the credit line snaps here. The lenders, who happily gave gold to the charismatic victor, are suddenly checking their ledgers, realising that a 9-month-old baby is a very poor credit risk. The interest rates climb. The patience of the City of London wears thin. We feel the anxiety seeping into the stone of Westminster, a cold draught that has nothing to do with the weather. The myth of the invincible English monarchy is being tested against the hard reality of actuarial tables. It is a quiet tragedy, played out in the scratching of pens and the murmuring of prayers. The baby king sits in his cradle, perhaps playing with a wooden toy, completely unaware that he has just become the CEO of a bankrupt multinational corporation that happens to have an army. There is a softness to this image, a vulnerability that contrasts sharply with the steel and fire of the war. We realize that the state is not an abstract entity, but a collection of fragile human beings, and right now, the most important human being in the dual monarchy cannot even speak. The seasons turn outside the nursery window, the leaves falling from the oaks in the royal park, marking the passage of time that no longer favours the English. Time, once their ally in the swift campaigns of Henry V, has now become their enemy, for every day that passes without a crowned adult king is a day where the glue of loyalty dries out and cracks. The French, battered as they are, begin to sense the hesitation, the pause in the hammer blows. We drift away from the nursery, leaving the infant king to his dreams, and move back towards the channel, where the grey water churns between the two kingdoms. The link between them is fraying. The golden thread of succession has held, technically, but it is pulled so tight that it sings in the wind, a high, thin note of tension that suggests it cannot bear the weight of the debt hanging from it. The era of the warrior king is over, buried in the crypt at Westminster Abbey. The era of the accountant, the regent, and the tax collector has begun, and it will be a much harder, colder, and more expensive struggle than anyone, even the wisest counsellor, can yet imagine. We drift now into the heart of Paris, to the Hôtel des Tournelles, a sprawling fortified residence that sits uneasily within a city that has never truly loved its new masters, where the Duke of Bedford, John of Lancaster, sits alone at a heavy oak table that seems to groan under the weight of the papers stacked upon it. He is the regent of France, the man tasked with the impossible job of ruling a dual monarchy for a nephew who cannot yet speak, and the air around him is thick with the scent of beeswax candles and the stale, cold dust of a room that is never quite warm enough. Outside, the streets of Paris are quiet, a sullen silence born of curfew and exhaustion. But inside, the silence is filled with the invisible noise of numbers that refuse to balance. We imagine Bedford as a warrior, the brother of Henry V, and indeed, he is a capable soldier who has just won a crushing victory at Verneuil, a battle so decisive it is called a second Agincourt. Yet, as he stares at the ledger open before him, there is no triumph in his eyes, only a profound, bone-deep weariness. The victory at Verneuil killed thousands of French and Scots, but it did not kill the debt. In fact, the campaign to achieve it has drained the last reserves of the Norman treasury, leaving the regent with a glorious battlefield report and an empty strongbox. It is here, in the solitude of command, that the true nature of the English position becomes painfully clear. They are trying to run 2 kingdoms on the budget of 1, and the math is simply broken. We watch his hand, calloused from the sword hilt, now cramping around a quill, as he signs yet another order for a forced loan, a benevolence that feels less like a gift and more like a robbery with each passing month. The ink dries slowly in the damp air, a black line that represents a promise to pay back gold that does not exist. Historians often overlook Bedford, overshadowed as he is by his glamorous brother Henry and his tragic nephew, but in these quiet hours, he emerges as the tragic hero of logistics, a man frantically building a dam out of paper to hold back a flood of insolvency. He has tried everything to make this conquest pay for itself. He has reformed the coinage, stamped with the dual arms of England and France, trying to create a stable currency that merchants will trust. But the metal is debased, shaved down by desperation. He has established a university at Caen to train loyal bureaucrats, hoping that a generation of lawyers will succeed where archers have stalled. But lawyers require salaries, and the revenue from the wool tax is down again. We feel the crushing pressure of the Burgundian alliance, the diplomatic marriage of convenience between England and the powerful Duke of Burgundy, which is the only thing keeping the English position in France alive. But Burgundy is an expensive friend, a wealthy, demanding ally who must be courted with constant gifts, territories, and bribes. We see Bedford reading a letter from Duke Philip of Burgundy, a polite, flowery missive that essentially demands a fortune in silver plate or a new county as the price for his continued friendship. It is a form of geopolitical blackmail that Bedford has no choice but to pay, for if Burgundy turns, Paris falls. The silken cord that binds the two powers is actually a golden chain, and it is wrapped tightly around the regent's neck. There is a gentle, almost sad humour in seeing the most powerful man in France personally checking the accounts of his own household, counting the candles and the loaves of bread, realising that he is spending his own private fortune to prop up the state, melting down his own family plate to pay the garrisons that protect Sasser the king's claim. The state is not an abstract machine here. It is John of Lancaster's personal bank account, slowly draining away into the mud of the Loire Valley. We sense the ghostly presence of his brother Henry the Fife in the room, a legendary shadow that casts a long, impossible standard against which Bedford is constantly measured. Henry had the easy part, the flash of conquest and the early death. Bedford has the hard part, the long, grinding governance of a people who resent him, in a land that is vast and absorbs armies like a sponge. The map on the wall shows the English sphere of influence stretching deep into the south, a wash of red ink that looks impressive, but the map does not show the rot. The bridges that are crumbling, the roads infested with brigands because the patrols have been cut, the local captains who are turning into warlords because the central authority cannot pay them. We drift through the thoughts of the regent, feeling his frustration with the council back in London, led by his erratic brother Gloucester, who seems to think that France is a bottomless treasure chest rather than a bottomless pit. Every letter from London asks for money or news of glory. Every letter from Bedford asks for men and patience. The disconnect is widening, a channel of misunderstanding deeper than the sea that separates them. The wind rattles the leaded glass windows, a lonely sound that emphasises the isolation of this position. Bedford is ruling a kingdom of paper, treaties, indentures, tax rolls, pardon letters, hoping that if he generates enough paper, it will somehow turn into stone and stability. But the paper is fragile. We notice the edges of the ledger are worn, the vellum specifically scraped and reused, a subtle sign of the scarcity of materials, or perhaps just the obsessive thrift of a man who watches every penny. The dual monarchy was meant to be a union of crowns, a harmonious merging of two great powers, but in the flickering candlelight it looks more like a parasitic relationship where the host is dying. The French subjects, the Lancastrian French, are tired of the war, tired of the taxes, tired of the English archers who speak a guttural tongue and drink too much ale. Their loyalty is thin, held in place only by the competence of this one tired man at the table. If he stops working, even for a moment, the whole structure begins to slide. We feel a deep, empathetic, heavy-heartedness for him, the responsible middle child of history, doing the homework that no one else wants to do, knowing that the teacher will likely fail him anyway. The fire in the hearth has burned down to embers, glowing with a dull, failing heat that mirrors the state of the English occupation. Still hot, still dangerous, but fading, requiring more fuel than is available to keep the flame leaping high. The shadows in the corners of the room seem to lengthen, taking on the shapes of creditors and unpaid mercenaries, a silent chorus waiting for their due. As Bedford finally closes the ledger, the heavy thud of the cover echoes like a gavel in an empty courtroom, a judgment rendered against a future that cannot be afforded. He rubs his eyes, the friction sounding loud in the stillness, and for a brief second, we see him not as a duke or a regent, but just a man who is incredibly tired of owing money. He blows out the candle, plunging the room into darkness, but the debt remains, invisible and heavy in the dark, waiting for the sun to rise so it can begin to accumulate interest once again. The night air of Paris is cold, indifferent to titles and claims, and as the city sleeps under the watch of unpaid guards, the impossible ledger sits on the table, a silent testament to the fact that while kings may declare wars, it is the accountants who must suffer them, and right now, the math is whispering that the end is beginning, one subtracted coin at a time. We drift south now, following the slow, muddy tracks of ox carts and marching men towards the banks of the Loire, where the city of Orléans sits like a stone knot in the artery of France, blocking the English from the warm, rich lands of the south. The year is 1428, and the season is turning towards a wet and bitter autumn, the kind that seeps into the bones and makes the simple act of digging a trench feel like a punishment from God. We imagine a siege as a ring of steel, a tight, unbroken chain of soldiers surrounding a doomed city. But the reality here is far more porous and far more expensive. It is a sprawling, disjointed collection of wooden forts, called bastilles, scattered across the landscape, islands of English authority in a sea of mud. The river flows past them, grey and swollen, indifferent to the claims of the men on either bank, carrying driftwood and ice floes that batter the pilings of the bridges. The siege is not a sudden storm of violence. It is a slow construction project, a massive investment of timber, earth, and labour that must be maintained day after day, week after week. We watch the English soldiers, not charging in glory, but swinging axes in the nearby forests, cutting down thousands of trees to build palisades, their breath steaming in the cold air. Every tree felled is a cost calculated in man-hours. Every spade of earth moved for the ramparts is energy that requires food to replenish. The English commander, the Earl of Salisbury, Thomas Montague, is a man of the old school, a veteran who understands the geometry of war, and he knows that this siege is a gamble of the highest order. He is investing the last fresh-field army England can scrape together into a single point of pressure, hoping the dam will break before his own resources run dry. But the city of Orléans does not break, it absorbs. The walls are high, the granaries inside are relatively full, and the citizens are stubborn. We feel the frustration in the English camp, a heavy, dull boredom that is more dangerous than fear. To keep an army sitting still is ruinously expensive. Men who are marching can forage and loot, living off the enemy's land, but men who are sitting in a siege line quickly eat the surrounding countryside bare. The supply lines stretch back to Paris and Normandy like thin, brittle threads, and every wagon of bread that arrives has cost a fortune to protect from French raiders. It is here, in the shadow of the Tournelles fortress guarding the bridge, that the fragility of the modern war machine reveals itself. On a quiet Sunday, a moment that feels almost accidental in its tragedy, a cannonball, fired perhaps by a lucky gunner, or perhaps just guided by the random chaos of the universe, smashes through a window where Salisbury is observing the city. It is a shock of violence that lasts only a second, metal shattering stone and bone, taking the face and the life of the most capable English general. We see the confusion that follows, not just the grief, but the sudden, terrifying depreciation of leadership capital. The army has lost its brain, and the siege loses its focus, drifting into a lethargic stalemate, where the only thing moving is the money flowing out of the war chest. Historians still argue whether Salisbury could have taken the city had he lived, whether his aggressive spirit would have forced a conclusion. But the reality we see is a headless beast settling down to starve, unaware that it is starving itself. The siege becomes a sunk cost trap. They have spent too much to leave, so they spend more to stay. The winter deepens, and the ledger of the siege fills with entries for firewood, for blankets, for replacement horses to haul the heavy guns that sit silent in the mud. There is a dark, almost farcical humour to be found in the famous Battle of the Herrings that takes place in February. We watch a convoy of English wagons, laden not with gold or weapons, but with barrels of salted fish for the army's Lenten meals, being ambushed by a French force. The resulting skirmish is fierce, men dying in the snow amidst shattered staves and spilled herring, a battle fought literally for the sake of lunch. It is a scene that captures the absurdity of the situation. Knights in plate armour, the pinnacle of chivalric evolution, fighting desperately to protect dried fish because the logistics of the siege have become so precarious that the loss of a meal could break the army's morale. The English archers, using the wagons as cover, win the day, their arrows flying true, but the victory is hollow. They have secured their dinner, but they are no closer to securing the city. The wind howls across the flat plains of the Beauce, whipping the tents and chilling the sentries who stare at the lights of Orléans, wondering why the city doesn't just surrender. Inside the Bastilles, the air smells of wet straw, unwashed bodies, and the smoke of green wood that refuses to burn cleanly. The soldiers are not paid, or paid in arrears, and they gamble with IOUs, trading future promises for present comforts. The commanders write letters to Bedford in Paris, begging for more men, more powder, more coin. But Bedford has nothing left to send. He is scraping the bottom of the barrel, pawning the crown jewels, borrowing from his own officers. The siege of Orléans, meant to be the final nail in the coffin of the Valois monarchy, has instead become a heavy stone tied around the neck of the Lancastrian state. We sense the shift in the earth's rhythm here, a subtle turning of the tide that has nothing to do with the moon. The momentum of the conquest, which has rolled forward for 15 years, has finally hit a wall it cannot knock down and cannot afford to climb. The Bastilles are not symbols of power, they are prisons for the besiegers, locking them into a futile expense that drains the treasury drop by drop. The River Loire flows on, indifferent, carrying the silt of the mountains to the sea, just as time carries away the illusion of English dominance. We leave the English camp in the grey light of dawn, the soldiers huddled around their fires, eating their hard-won herring, completely unaware that the wind is bringing a strange new sound from the south, not the tramp of a relieving army, but the rumours of a miracle, a voice that will speak not of logistics and loans, but of God and France, a currency that the English accountants have absolutely no way to value. The trap of the siege is complete. They have bought nothing but a patch of muddy ground and a winter of misery, and the bill for this nothingness will be the loss of everything they have built. The wind shifts now, carrying us away from the stagnant freezing mud of the siege lines and south towards the valley of the Vienne, where the Château de Chinon rises above the slate-grey roofs of the town like a jagged crown of stone. The air here is warmer, smelling of wood smoke and the faint, sweet scent of the first spring blossoms trying to push through the frost. But inside the great hall, the atmosphere is thick with a stale, exhausted cynicism. We find the Dauphin, Charles, a man who has not yet been crowned king, standing in the shadows of a torchlit alcove, wearing velvet that is frayed at the cuffs, a visual metaphor for his dwindling fortunes. He is surrounded by courtiers who whisper in hushed, anxious tones, men who have spent years calculating the precise date of their inevitable defeat, measuring the shrinking treasury against the advancing English line. It is a court of bankruptcy, both moral and financial, where the only currency left is doubt. Into this room of tired men and faded tapestries walks a figure that defies every rule of the ledger, a teenage peasant girl, Joan, who calls herself the maid. She enters not with a contract for mercenaries or a chest of borrowed gold, but with a terrifying absolute certainty that feels like a sudden draught of cold air in a heated room. We imagine the awkward silence that falls over the gathered nobles, the rustle of silk stopping as they stare at this anomaly in cropped hair and men's clothes. There is a gentle, almost bewildered humour in the scene. Generals who have studied the art of war for decades, who know the cost of every horseshoe and arrow, listening to a farm girl explain that the King of Heaven has sent her to fix their logistics. It seems absurd, a desperate joke played by a dying kingdom, yet Charles listens. He listens because he is out of options, out of money, and out of hope. The decision to give her armour and a horse is not a leap of faith so much as a final, reckless wager of a gambler who has only one chip left. Historians still debate what exactly happened in their private meeting, whether she revealed a secret known only to him or simply spoke to the deep, paralyzing insecurity in his heart. But the result is a shift in the physics of the war. She offers something that the English, with all their tax rolls and indentures, cannot buy. She offers belief. And belief, it turns out, is a form of economic stimulus. As news of the maid spreads, a strange thing happens to the lethargic, defeated population of loyal France. They begin to give. They, cities that had claimed poverty, suddenly find supplies to send. Captains who had refused to march without pay suddenly rally their men for the promise of something holy. The economy of belief unlocks resources that the economy of gold could not touch. We drift with her army now, moving north towards Orléans, and the texture of the march is different. It is not the sullen, professional trudge of unpaid mercenaries, but a pilgrimage armed with pikes. The soldiers stop swearing, at least when she is within earshot, and the camp followers are chased away, replaced by priests and hymns that drift over the fields like a strange, harmonious fog. When they arrive at Orléans, the English in their bastilles stare out from behind their wooden palisades, and for the first time the cold calculation of the occupation falters. They see a girl in white armour riding under a banner of lilies, and the fear that grips them is not tactical but primal. The English army is a machine built on logic, on the assumption that superior logistics and archery will always win, but this is outside the spreadsheet. We watch the siege collapse, not in months, but in days. The forts that the English spent all winter building, the expensive timber and the weary labour, are stormed with a ferocity that ignores the cost of life. Joan leads the charge, not from the rear, like a sensible general, but from the front, taking an arrow to the shoulder, and, in a moment that surely terrified the English more than any cannon, getting back up to keep fighting. The investment of the siege, the millions of pennies spent on herring and wages and walls, is liquidated in a week of fire and shouting. We see the English commander, the Earl of Suffolk, retreating from the ruins of his expensive bastilles, his face a mask of shock. He has been defeated by a force that has no line item in the budget. The siege is lifted, and the bells of Orléans ring out, a sound that carries across the river and into the deep, quiet countryside, announcing that the long, slow decline of the English conquest has turned into a sudden, sharp slide. The psychological impact is devastating to the English credit. Suddenly, God is perceived to be French, and God is a creditor who does not need to be paid in silver. The relief of the city is not just a military victory, it is a financial disaster for the English crown. They have lost the sunk costs of the siege, they have lost the momentum that allowed them to borrow, and they have lost the aura of invincibility that kept their garrisons safe. We feel the change in the air as the spring turns into summer, a lightness in the French camp that contrasts with the heavy, brooding storm clouds gathering over the English regency in Paris. The Maid has proven that morale is a multiplier of force, that a motivated army can do with one loaf of bread what a demoralized army cannot do with 10. But even miracles have a cost, though it is not yet paid. For now, in the glow of the bonfire celebrations, with the citizens of Orléans weeping and cheering, it seems as though the war has been reset, that the slate has been wiped clean by the sheer purity of conviction. Yet, as we drift away from the city walls, leaving the chanting crowds behind, we catch a glimpse of the shadowed faces of the professional advisors, the chancellors and the treasurers, who are already wondering how to harness this wild, unpredictable energy, how to bottle the lightning and put it on a balance sheet. The war has moved from the realm of the accountant to the realm of the prophet, and that is a dangerous, unstable place to be, for prophets rarely survive the peace that follows the victory. The heat of July lies heavy on the fields of Champagne, a shimmering haze that distorts the horizon and turns the dust of the road into a choking golden powder that coats the throats of the marching army. We drift along this ancient Roman road, moving northeast, deeper into territory that the maps say belongs to the enemy. Yet the army moves with a strange, dreamlike confidence, led not by the shouting of sergeants, but by the quiet, terrifying momentum of a prophecy fulfilling itself. This is the sacred march, a journey that defies all military logic, for the Dauphin Charles is taking his army past fortified English garrisons, ignoring supply lines and marching straight for the heart of the Burgundian occupation to claim a city that lies deep behind the shield wall of his foes. The objective is Reims, the city of kings, the only place on earth where a man can be truly made the monarch of France. We feel the tension in the saddle, leather and the sweat of the horses. This is a gamble of breathtaking audacity, a bet placed on the idea that the symbol of the crown is worth more than the reality of the army. The towns they pass, Troyes, Chalons, shut their gates at first, terrified of the witch and her wild soldiers. But then, in a cascade of surrenders that feels almost magical, the gates swing open. It is as if the land itself is remembering its old allegiance, or perhaps the garrisons are simply making a pragmatic calculation that it is better to bow to a king who is coming than to wait for a regent who is absent. We watch the keys of these cities being handed over, not in battle, but in dusty parleys outside the walls, where the currency of exchange is fear and hope rather than silver. And then finally, the spires of Reims Cathedral rise from the plains, soaring intricate fingers of stone reaching for the heaven that has seemingly chosen a side. We enter the cool, vast interior of the cathedral on the 17th of July, 1429, leaving the blinding summer sun for the stained glass twilight of the nave. The air here is ancient, holding the chill of centuries and the scent of beeswax and old incense, a sensory memory of every king who has knelt here since Clovis. The silence is profound, broken only by the rustle of hasty preparations, for this is a coronation improvised on the run. There is no time for the weeks of feasting and pageantry that usually accompany such an event. The tapestries are hung quickly to hide the dust, The robes are pulled from travel chests, and the guards at the doors are still wearing their road-stained armour. Yet, as Charles kneels before the altar, none of the rush matters. We focus on the single critical object that transforms this from a desperate political stunt into a metaphysical revolution: the Sainte Ampoule. The Holy Ampulla. It is a tiny glass vial said to have been brought by a dove from heaven, containing the sacred oil of anointment. This oil is the ultimate liquid asset of the French monarchy, a substance that cannot be bought, traded, or taxed. When the Archbishop of Reims, who has just returned to his own cathedral, dips his thumb into the oil and touches the forehead, shoulders, and chest of the kneeling man, a transaction occurs that is far more binding than any bank loan. Charles is no longer the Dauphin, the disinherited pretender living on credit. He is now the King of France, appointed by God. The transformation is legal, spiritual, and crucially financial. A crowned king can sign treaties that matter. A crowned king can levy taxes with the weight of divine law. A crowned king is a credit risk that bankers are willing to take. We see the crown being placed on his head. Perhaps not the ancient crown of Charlemagne, which is locked away in English-controlled St. Denis, but a crown nonetheless. And in that moment, the balance sheet of the war tilts violently. The English still hold Paris, they still hold Normandy, and they still have the superior administration, but they have lost the monopoly on legitimacy. We look at the faces of the crowd, the weeping townsfolk and the hardened captains, and we realise that they are witnessing the creation of a new form of value. Charles has effectively bypassed the broken economy of the war by minting a new currency: sovereignty. There is a soft, ironic smile to be found in the reaction of the English command when the news reaches them. They are baffled, furious, and terrified. They have a king too, little Henry VI, but he is a child sitting in London, uncrowned and unanointed. In the marketplace of perception, the English have been outmaneuvered by a teenager and a vial of oil. They are holding a depreciating asset, the conquest, while Charles has just secured the title deed to the kingdom. We sense the weight of the ceremony ending, the heavy organ notes fading into the rafters, and the king rising from his knees. He is still poor. His doublet is perhaps a little threadbare under the ermine, and his army is still unpaid, waiting outside in the heat for their wages. But the atmosphere has changed. The debt he carries is no longer the desperate borrowing of a rebel. It is the national debt of a sovereign state. The King of Bourges, as his enemies mocked him, has vanished, replaced by Charles VII, the victorious. The journey back from the altar is a walk through a different world. The stained glass casts pools of red and blue light on the stone floor, illuminating the path of a man who has learned that in the game of nations, power is a shadow cast by belief. The war will continue. The blood will still flow, and the gold will still vanish into the maw of the conflict. But the existential question has been answered. France has a head. The English Regency, for all its ledgers and efficient tax collection, suddenly looks like a tenant who has overstayed their lease while the landlord has just returned home with the keys. We drift out of the cathedral, back into the blinding light of the square, where the cheers of the crowd wash over the new king, a sound that drowns out the quiet, nagging truth that the treasury is still empty and the soldiers are still hungry. But for today, under the high summer sun, the illusion is perfect, and in the history of kingdoms, the illusion is often the only thing that is real. The sacred march has achieved its aim, not by capturing a fortress, but by capturing the imagination, and as the army prepares to move again, confident and crowned, we understand that the war has shifted from a fight for survival to a fight for eviction. A long, slow process of pushing the English out, one consecrated mile at a time. The air in the great hall of the Abbey of St. Vast in Arras is thick enough to choke on, a cloying mixture of roasted peacock, expensive spices, sweat, and the heavy metallic scent of gold brocade heating up in the late summer humidity. It is the autumn of 1435, and we have drifted into what looks like a celebration, but is, in reality, a battlefield far more lethal to the English cause than Agincourt ever was. This is the Congress of Arras, the diplomatic event of the century, a gathering so lavish that the wine flows in the fountains and the streets are paved with tapestries, all funded by the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, who is acting as the host, the arbiter, and the man holding the knife. We watch the English delegation, led by the Cardinal Beaufort, moving through this riot of colour in their severe red robes, looking like men who have wandered into a party they cannot afford. They are here to negotiate a peace, but the atmosphere is not one of reconciliation, it is one of suffocation. The room is filled with the whisper of silk and the scratching of secretaries recording every word, a low, insect-like hum that underscores the tension. We imagine that peace treaties are signed with smiles and handshakes, but the truth is a brutal, grinding haggling over the price of pride. The French offer is on the table, and it is a generous, almost insulting temptation. The English can keep Normandy and Aquitaine, the lands they have bled for, but there is one condition. They must renounce the title King of France. They must admit that the war was a mistake, that the claim of Edward III and Henry V was a legal fiction. We feel the weight of this demand pressing down on the English envoys. To accept it is to secure the peace, but it is also to declare moral bankruptcy. It would mean telling the Parliament back in Westminster that 20 years of taxes, the pawning of the crown jewels, and the thousands of dead archers were for nothing but a lie. It is the ultimate sunk cost fallacy, played out in real time under the vaulted ceilings of an abbey. The English refuse. They stand on their honour, which is the only thing they have left. And in doing so, they walk away from the only lifeline that could save their treasury. There is a tragic, almost unbearable irony in this moment. The diplomats are arguing over the phrasing of a title while their soldiers in Normandy are eating rats. We see the Duke of Burgundy watching them, his face a mask of polite regret. He has been the ally of England for 16 years, the anchor of their power, but he is a businessman at heart, and he knows a bad investment when he sees one. The English are insolvent, their king is a child, and their regent is dying. And so, with the stroke of a pen, the great betrayal happens. Burgundy switches sides. He reconciles with Charles VII, the man who murdered his father, because in the cold arithmetic of statecraft, a solvent enemy is better than a bankrupt friend. The signing of the Treaty of Arras is not a shout, but a rustle of parchment that echoes like a thunderclap across the Channel. It is the sound of the English position in Europe collapsing. But the tragedy of this moment is not just in the hall. It is happening simultaneously a few hundred miles away in the city of Rouen. There, in a room that smells of sickness and the river, John, Duke of Bedford, the regent who held the war together with his bare hands, is dying. We drift to his bedside, where the man who spent his life fighting for his brother's dream is taking his final, shallow breaths. He dies on September 14th, just days before the treaty is finalised, and it seems, as perhaps the universe's final mercy, that he does not live to see the ink dry on the betrayal. He dies, knowing that the structure he built is made of sand, and the tide has just come in. The coincidence of his death and the diplomatic disaster feels like a heavy, poetic punctuation mark. The end of the competent age. With Bedford gone, the brain of the English occupation is dead. With Burgundy gone, the arm is severed. The news travels slowly, carried by riders on exhausted horses, moving from the feasting halls of Arras to the gloomy councils of London. We feel the shockwave hitting the English capital, a cold realization that they are now alone against a united France. The war has changed from a contest of dynasties into a struggle for national survival, and England has just chosen to continue fighting it without money, without allies, and without a leader. The diplomat's empty table at Arras stands as a monument to the price of pride. The English delegation packs their chests, rolling up their banners and their rejected treaties, preparing to leave the city that has rejected them. They walk out into the rain, their heads held high, clinging to a claim that is now worth less than the paper it is written on. Behind them, the laughter of the French and Burgundian lords rings out, a sound of relief and reunion, the sound of a family squabble ending while the intruder is shown the door. The feast continues, the wine is poured, and the debts of the past are forgiven between the former enemies, while the English ride toward the coast, carrying nothing but the heavy, crushing weight of a war that they can no longer win, yet refuse to stop fighting. The gold has run out, the friends have gone, and all that remains is the long, expensive, and lonely road to defeat. The winter of 1436 descends upon Paris not just as a season, but as a judgment, a deep, penetrating cold that freezes the Seine so solid that carts can be driven across the ice, their wheels rumbling over the black water trapped beneath. We drift through the streets of the capital, which are silent, empty, and terrifyingly white. The snow covering the cobblestones like a shroud that hides the accumulated filth of 2 decades of occupation. The city is starving. The price of wheat has soared beyond the reach of anyone but the collaborators, and the poor are reduced to eating bread made of bean flour and tree bark, huddled in doorways that offer no protection from the biting wind. It is a time of wolves. Historical chronicles tell us, with a shiver of horror, that packs of wolves actually entered the city limits during these dark months, snatching dogs and even children from the streets, a visceral sign that the civilization built by the English administration is crumbling back into the wild. We find the English garrison, commanded by Lord Willoughby, barricaded inside the Bastille and the Louvre, isolated islands of authority in a sea of sullen resentment. They are few in number, perhaps only a few thousand men to hold a metropolis of tens of thousands, and they are unpaid, cold and forgotten by a government in London that is paralysed by its own infighting. The soldiers look out from the high walls at the smoke rising from the chimneys of the burghers, knowing that they are no longer the masters of this house. They are merely unwanted guests who refuse to leave. The mood in the city is not one of revolutionary fire, people are too hungry for rage, but of a deep, exhausted pragmatism. They simply want the war to end, and they have realised that the English cannot end it. We feel the tension snapping on a grey morning in April, not with the roar of cannon, but with the quiet creaking of rusty hinges. The Constable of France, Arthur de Richemont, a man who has switched sides more than once, but who now rides for Charles VII, approaches the Saint-Jacques gate. There is no grand assault, no scaling of ladders. Instead, the citizens of Paris, the merchants and the aldermen who have spent years calculating the cost of loyalty, simply unlock the gates. It is a business decision. The English credit has finally run out. We watch the French troops ride in, not as conquerors, but as old friends returning from a long journey, greeted by a population that is shouting Noel, a cry not of Christmas, but of deliverance. The English soldiers in the streets are not massacred. They are ignored, swamped by the tide of history turning against them, forced to retreat hastily into the fortress of the Bastille. There is a strange, almost polite quality to this revolution. The English are trapped, but the French do not want to waste blood digging them out. A deal is struck, a final transaction in a war of ledgers. The English garrison is allowed to leave, to march out with their lives and their personal possessions, provided they never return. We witness this surreal procession as the English troops file out of the city they ruled for 16 years. They are jeered, yes, pelted with mud and snowballs by the very people who sold them wine a week ago, but they are alive. Lord Willoughby rides at the head, his face set in a mask of grim dignity, leaving behind the capital of the kingdom his master claimed to own. As they pass through the gates and out into the open country, the weight of the loss settles on them. Paris is gone. The jewel of the conquest, the place where Henry VI was crowned, has slipped away not because it was stormed, but because it was no longer profitable to keep. The English are now pushed back to Normandy, to the coast, their empire shrinking with every step of the horses' hooves. The wind howls across the frozen fields, mocking their retreat, and we feel a profound sense of isolation. England is alone now. The dual monarchy is a fiction that exists only on old parchment. The city behind them begins to warm up, the fires relit, the markets reopening, the flow of French coin and French law returning to the arteries of the capital. It feels like a body rejecting a transplant, a natural, inevitable expulsion of something that never truly belonged. The wolves may still prowl the outskirts, but the two-legged wolves have left, and as the gates of Paris slam shut behind them, the sound echoes all the way to Westminster, a heavy, final thud that signals the beginning of the end. The dream of a continental empire has died in the snow, leaving only the cold reality of a retreat that will not stop until the sea itself swallows the last English soldier. The years that follow the loss of Paris do not roar with the sound of great battles, but rather drag on in a sullen, grinding stalemate, a time of inconclusive skirmishes and raids that serve only to burn harvests and empty treasuries without moving the lines on the map. We drift through this haze of exhaustion to the year 1444, arriving in the city of Tours, where the air is soft with the scent of the Loire Valley's blooming vineyards, a stark contrast to the scorched earth of the north. Here, in the quiet tapestried chambers of a royal parley, the English and French have come together not to fight, but to breathe. It is the truce of Tours, a pause in the violence born not of friendship, but of mutual bankruptcy. England is spent. The Parliament in London is refusing to vote for new taxes. The Crown is drowning in debt, and the King, Henry VI, is now a grown man who shrinks from the very idea of war, a pious, gentle soul who would rather pray than rule. France, though ascending, is also tired, its land scarred by decades of chevauchés, and so they seek a marriage to seal the silence. We watch the Earl of Suffolk, William de la Pole, the head of the English delegation, walking through the gardens of the chateau, his brow furrowed with the weight of a terrible secret. He is here to negotiate a wedding between his king and Margaret of Anjou, the niece of the French queen. Margaret is young, beautiful, and formidable, possessing a spine of steel that her future husband lacks, but she brings no dowry. In the brutal economics of royal marriages, she is a bad deal, a bride who brings no gold, no land, and no armies. But Suffolk agrees to the match, and not only does he agrees to a secret condition that will eventually destroy him. To buy this peace, to buy this bride, England agrees to surrender the county of Maine to the French. It is a diplomatic transaction of breathtaking incompetence. England is giving away strategic territory to marry a woman who brings nothing but a truce. We feel the heavy, suffocating silence of the room where this deal is whispered. It is a peace bought on credit, a mortgage taken out on the national security of England to pay for a few years of quiet. We imagine the wedding proxy ceremony. the grandeur of the feasts, the wine flowing freely, yet underneath the silk and the laughter there is a rot. The English public believes this marriage brings honour. They do not know it brings a surrender. We drift back to England, to the arrival of Margaret, the she-wolf, as she will later be known, landing on the grey shores to meet a husband who is more like a monk than a monarch. There is a tenderness in their meeting, a soft human moment, where Henry looks at this strong, vibrant woman and feels a sense of safety, unaware that her arrival signals the beginning of the end of his house. The truce of exhaustion settles over the land like a heavy blanket. The archers go home or turn to banditry. The ships rot in the harbour, but the cost of the war does not stop just because the fighting has ceased. The garrisons in Normandy still need to be paid, even if they are not fighting. The interest on the crown's debts continues to accumulate, a silent, invisible compound fracture in the economy of the state. And the soldiers, men who know only how to kill, are restless. We see them in the taverns of Rouen and Caen, unpaid, sullen, drinking on tab, staring at the French peasants with eyes that have seen too much. The peace is a lie. It is a period of stagnation where the French are using the time to modernise, to reorganise, to build the machine that will crush the English, while the English are using the time to dream. We feel the tension of the secret of Maine ticking away, like a bomb in the heart of the government. Suffolk knows that when the English people find out he gave away a county for a bride, they will tear him apart. The atmosphere in the court of Westminster is paranoid, hushed, filled with the rustle of whispers and the scratching of poisoned pen letters. The truce of Tours is not a resolution, it is a deep breath before the scream. It is the moment where the English crown, desperate to stop the bleeding of coin, cuts off its own arm. The summer days of 1444 stretch out, golden and warm, but they feel finite, numbered. We sense the inevitable shift, the way the tectonic plates of history are grinding together deep beneath the surface. The French King Charles VII is not sleeping. He is waiting. He knows that the truce is just a harvest season for his treasury, a time to fill the barns and cast the cannons. The English have bought time, but they have paid for it with the very land they crossed the sea to keep. As we watch Henry and Margaret ride through the cheering crowds of London, flowers raining down on them, we feel a profound sense of pity. They are celebrating a wedding, but we are witnessing a funeral for the English Empire in France. The bill for the peace is in the mail, and when it arrives, the price will be everything that remains. While England drifts through the fog of its uneasy truce, paralysed by the factional shouting matches of its dukes and the pious distraction of its king, a very different kind of silence has descended upon the administrative centres of France. We move now into the high-ceilinged, orderly chambers of the Hôtel de l'Argent in Bourges, a city that has become the beating heart of a quiet revolution. There is no smell of battlefield smoke here. Only the dry, dusty scent of sand used to blot ink and the sharp, metallic tang of silver coins being counted, stacked, and weighed with a rhythmic precision that sounds like the ticking of a vast, inevitable clock. We are witnessing the invention of the modern state, a creation forged not in the fires of war, but in the cool, ruthless logic of the ledger. King Charles VII, once the timid King of Bourges, has realised a fundamental truth that his English cousins have missed, that a king who must ask for money every time he wishes to fight is not truly a king, but a beggar with a crown. And so, during the lull of the truce, while the English quarrel over who is to blame for the past, the French are building the machinery of the future. The architect of this change is Jacques Coeur, a merchant prince with the mind of a mathematician and the soul of an adventurer, a man who understands that gold is not just wealth, it is fuel. We imagine him walking through the treasury, his fur-lined robes brushing against chests filled not with feudal dues, but with the proceeds of the tile, the first permanent direct tax in French history. It is a terrifying innovation for the medieval mind. For centuries, taxes were exceptional events, granted only for specific emergencies, but now the state has reached directly into the pocket of the subject, bypassing the local lords, and declared that the price of security is a yearly subscription. The peasant in the field grumbles, cursing the tax collector who arrives with the harvest. But he pays, and in paying, he buys something he has never had before, a professional army that actually protects him. We drift from the counting house to the training grounds near Nancy, where the result of this new gold is on display. It is a sight that would confuse a knight from the days of Agincourt. There are no colourful heraldic banners of individual barons, no chaotic mobs of levies called up for 40 days of service. Instead, we see rows of men in identical brigandines holding lances at the exact same angle, moving with a synchronized, eerie discipline. These are the compagnies d'ordonnance, the first standing army in Europe since the fall of Rome. They are not disbanded in winter. They are paid, fed, and housed year-round. They are professionals, ordonnance men, bound to the king by a contract of coin rather than a vow of fealty. We feel the ground tremble as they charge, a controlled thunder that speaks of endless drilling. The free companies, the bands of mercenaries who plagued France like locusts, eating the countryside bare between campaigns, have been crushed or absorbed into this machine. The king has monopolized violence. If you carry a sword in France now, you wear the king's colours, or you are an outlaw. There is a profound structural beauty to this, a sense of order emerging from chaos. But it is a cold beauty. The romance of chivalry, of the erratic, heroic knight seeking personal glory, is being paved over by the efficiency of the squad and the platoon. We notice the inspectors, the commissaires, riding between the companies, checking the muster rolls against the actual number of men, ensuring that no captain is drawing pay for ghost soldiers. It is a level of bureaucratic scrutiny that feels incredibly modern, a system of checks and balances designed to squeeze every ounce of lethality out of every livre tournois. Historians often point to the cannons or the relief of Orléans as the turning point, but the true death of the English ambition happens here in the boring, unglamorous work of tax reform. The English Parliament is still stuck in the old world, debating every subsidy, suspicious of every royal request, forcing the English crown to pawn its jewels and beg for loans. France, meanwhile, has unlocked a stream of revenue that flows regardless of the mood of the nobility. The tile is a river of silver that never dries up. We sense the shift in the balance of power not as a sudden tilt, but as the slow, heavy rotation of a millstone. The French state is becoming heavier, more dense, capable of exerting a sustained pressure that the fragile, debt-ridden English government cannot hope to match. Charles VII sits in his council chamber, no longer the desperate teenager saved by a vision, but a calculating monarch, surrounded by lawyers and bankers. He looks at the map of Normandy, not with the hunger of a conqueror, but with the patience of a landlord who knows the eviction notice has already been written. He is just waiting for the lease to expire. There is a gentle, almost sad humour in thinking of the English commanders across the border, polishing their armour and practising their archery, unaware that they are preparing for a knife fight while their opponent is buying a gun. The compagnies d'ordonnance are not just soldiers, they are the end of the Middle Ages. They represent the moment where war becomes too expensive for anyone but the state, where the personal courage of a longbowman is outweighed by the logistical capacity of a tax bracket. The atmosphere in the French camp is one of quiet, terrifying competence. The Smiths are forging standard issue cuirasses. The Fletchers are making arrows by the gross, paid for by receipts that will be honoured. The gens de finance, the men of money, have become as important as the men of war. We feel the vibration of this new engine, a low hum that resonates through the floorboards of the kingdom. It is the sound of a nation coalescing, hardening, turning from a loose collection of feudal obligations into a unified political entity capable of crushing its enemies with the sheer weight of its resources. The truce is still technically in effect. The diplomats are still smiling at each other in the courts of Europe, but the war has effectively already been decided by the accountants. The English are fighting on credit, the French are fighting on revenue, and in the long, harsh arithmetic of history, revenue always wins. We leave the orderly lines of the companies, the sunlight glinting off their standardized steel, and the feeling is not one of excitement, but of a heavy, inevitable finality. The chaotic, colourful, desperate struggles of the past century are over. The era of the machine has begun, and it is facing north, towards the unsuspecting garrisons of Normandy, who are still dreaming of a world that no longer exists. The fog that rolls off the Thames in the winter of 1449 is thick and yellow, tasting of coal smoke and the brackish rot of the tidal river, wrapping the Tower of London in a shroud that seems to muffle the very heartbeat of the kingdom. We drift through the heavy, iron-bound doors of the Jewel House, usually a place of blinding splendour where the physical manifestation of royal power is kept. But tonight the atmosphere is not one of awe, but of a quiet, desperate shame. The room is dimly lit by a single lantern, casting long, jumping shadows against the stone walls, and the air is cold, smelling of old velvet and the metallic bite of gold that has been handled by too many anxious hands. We find the Lord Treasurer, perhaps the exhaustion etched deep into his face, standing over a heavy oak chest that is open like a coffin. He is not admiring the crown jewels. He is inventorying them for a pawn shop. It is a scene of profound humiliation that history often skips over in favour of battles, but here, in the scratching of the clerk's quill, lies the true defeat of the English Empire. We watch as the riche fleur-de-lis, a magnificent gold ornament studded with rubies and pearls, is lifted from its velvet cushion, not to be worn by the king, but to be weighed by a sombre merchant from the city. The transaction is hushed, hurried, as if they are committing a crime. The crown is literally selling its history to pay for its present. The great collar of gold, the heavy silver basins used for royal christenings, the jewelled swords of past victories, all of them are being converted into liquidity, transformed into sacks of coin that will disappear instantly into the black hole of the Normandy garrisons. We feel the weight of this loss. These are not just objects, they are the frozen legitimacy of the state, and as they disappear into the merchant strongbox, the aura of the monarchy dims. Myth tells us that kings are fountains of wealth, figures who bestow gold upon the loyal, but the reality of 1449 is a king who is a beggar in his own capital, a man who eats his dinner off pewter plates because the silver service has been melted down to buy wheat for soldiers who hate him. Outside the tower, the city of London is suffering through the great slump, a crushing economic depression that has settled over the island like a physical weight. The looms in the weaving districts are silent, covered in dust, because the export markets in Flanders have dried up due to the diplomatic blunders of the court. The wool sacks pile up in the warehouses, damp and unsold, their smell turning from the scent of prosperity to the scent of mildew. We sense the anger simmering in the streets, a cold, hard rage directed at the traitors surrounding the king who have allowed the economy to collapse. There is a shortage of silver bullion across Europe, a famine of money that makes every coin feel precious and rare, exacerbating the crown's inability to pay its debts. The government has stopped paying its bills entirely. The royal household is running on IOUs, and the tradesmen who supply the palace with bread and candles are going bankrupt because the king cannot settle his tab. It is a systemic failure of credit. The faith that holds a currency together has evaporated, replaced by a cynical bartering of favours and lands. We drift across the channel to see the consequences of this bankruptcy on the front lines, where the English army has degenerated into something unrecognisable. The garrisons in Normandy, unpaid for months, sometimes years, have ceased to be soldiers and have become organised bandits. We watch a group of English archers, their livery coats stained and torn, raiding a French village, not a village of the enemy, but a village in the territory they are supposed to be protecting. They are stealing chickens, grain and wine, not out of cruelty, but out of hunger. The chain of command has broken. The captain cannot punish them because he cannot pay them. The protection racket that was the justification for English rule has collapsed. The peasantry is now being terrorised by its own guardians. There is a tragic irony in seeing the English commanders, men like the elderly Talbot, trying to maintain discipline with empty pockets. They write furious letters to London, begging for the proceeds of the pawned jewels, but the money, when it arrives, is already too little, eaten up by the interest on old loans. The law of the instrument takes over. When you have a hammer and no money, everything looks like a nail you can steal. We feel the moral rot spreading through the army like gangrene. The chivalric code, which was always a thin veneer over the brutality of war, has completely dissolved. These men are not fighting for Henry VI anymore. They are fighting to survive the winter. Back in Westminster, the paranoia is suffocating. The Duke of Suffolk, the architect of the truce, is now the most hated man in England, the scapegoat for a bankruptcy that is decades in the making. We see him walking the corridors of power, glancing over his shoulder, knowing that the mob, which includes the lesser gentry and the merchants, is baying for blood. They believe the money has been stolen, hidden in Suffolk's coffers, because they cannot accept the terrifying truth that there is no money. The money was fired out of cannons, eaten by horses, and sunk in the Channel. The state is hollow. We drift through the king's own chambers, where Henry VI sits in prayer, a figure of tragic disconnect. He handles a rosary of simple wood, perhaps the only thing he owns that hasn't been mortgaged. He is a man of peace, born into a world that demands a warlord, a man of poverty born into a position that demands a plutocrat. The silence in his room is heavy with the things he refuses to acknowledge. The angry shouts from the street, the piles of unpaid petitions, the reports of French troops massing on the borders. He believes that God will provide, but his counsellors know that God does not issue letters of credit. The atmosphere of the year is one of holding one's breath before the plunge. The truce is fraying. The secret of Maine has been revealed, and the French are ready. But England is not just unprepared militarily, it is incapacitated financially. It is like a knight trying to enter a tournament after selling his armour and his horse. The crown jewels, now sitting in the dark vaults of Lombard bankers, are a symbol of a sovereignty that has been leased out. We feel the damp chill of the empty treasury room in Westminster, where the rats scurry across the floorboards that once groaned under the weight of tax silver. The dust motes dance in the pale light, settling on the empty shelves. The story of the war is often told as a story of battles lost, of tactical errors and bad luck, but here, in the quiet, dusty silence of the pawnshop state, we see the real cause of the catastrophe. The war ended not with a bang, but with a bounce check. The English have spent their past, their present, and their future, and now, as the French armies begin to move in the distance, the bill is finally being presented to a kingdom that has nothing left to give but its land. The winter fog thickens outside, blurring the line between the river and the sky, just as the line between the king's property and his debt has blurred into a grey, indistinguishable mess of ruin. We leave the treasurer to his hopeless arithmetic, knowing that no amount of calculation can create gold from thin air, and that the only thing left to spend is blood. The collapse, when it finally arrives in the summer of 1449, does not move with the slow, grinding pace of the previous decades, but with the terrifying speed of a landslide, a sudden, violent shedding of territory that leaves the chroniclers breathless, trying to keep up with the names of the falling cities. We drift above the landscape of Normandy, the second England that Henry V and Bedford spent 30 years building, and we watch it dissolve like a sugar castle in a rainstorm. The French army that crosses the border is not the ragged collection of partisans from the old days. It is the machine we saw being built in Bourges, a glistening, well-oiled engine of conquest that moves with a unified purpose. They do not just attack, they envelop. The recouvrance, the recovery, has begun, and it feels less like a war and more like a foreclosure. We see the English garrisons, those isolated pockets of unpaid, hungry men, watching from their battlements as the blue banners of Charles V emerge from the forests. There is no defiance in their eyes, only a weary calculation. Why die for a king who hasn't paid you in 2 years? Why hold a wall that is already crumbling? One by one, the gates open. Pont de l'Arche, Conches, Verneuil. Names that were once etched in English pride are now signed away in hurried capitulations. The war is a series of conversations between a well-fed French captain offering generous terms and a starving English captain accepting them. The currency of the conquest has devalued to zero. We focus our gaze on the capital of the occupation, the great city of Rouen, where the Duke of Somerset, Edmund Beaufort, sits trapped in the castle. He is the successor to the mighty Bedford, but he has none of the resources and none of the luck. The city outside his fortress is in open revolt. The citizens, who have endured the English presence for a generation, have sensed the shift in the wind and are now throwing stones at the English patrols, cutting the ropes of the wells and signalling to the French army camped outside the walls. Somerset is not fighting a siege, he is fighting a mutiny. The atmosphere inside the castle is suffocating, thick with the smell of panic and unwashed bodies. We feel the humiliation of the moment when Somerset realises he has no choice. He cannot fight the French army without and the French citizens within. He surrenders. But the price of his safety is catastrophic. To save his own skin and the lives of his garrison, he agrees to pay a massive indemnity and, more painfully, to hand over other castles that he still supposedly commands. It is a bankruptcy liquidation disguised as a treaty. We watch the English troops marching out of Rouen in October, a grey, rainy day that matches the colour of their spirits. They are jeered by the crowds, the same crowds whose fathers might have cheered Henry V. The great enterprise, the dream of a dual monarchy, is being dismantled brick by brick, and the stones are being thrown at the retreating soldiers. But the true tragedy of this collapse is not found in the castles of the dukes, but on the muddy roads leading to the coast. We drift down to the level of the cart tracks, where we see a sight that breaks the heart of the narrative: the refugees. These are not soldiers. They are English families, weavers, bakers, farmers, who were encouraged to settle in Normandy, who bought land, built houses and raised children who have never seen England. They are the colonists of a failed empire, and now they are homeless. We see a woman pushing a handcart piled high with bedding and cooking pots, her children walking beside her in the mud, looking back at the smoke rising from a farm. that was their entire world. They are leaving the only home they know, heading for a country, England, that does not want them, that views them as failures and burdens. They are the human cost of the king's bankruptcy, the debris left behind when the tide of history goes out. The roads to the port of Harfleur and Cherbourg are clogged with this river of misery, a slow-moving procession of the dispossessed. They speak a dialect of English, mixed with Norman French, a language that will die out with them, a linguistic ghost of the occupation. The speed of the French advance is fueled by the very thing the English lack, heavy artillery. The French Bureau brothers have perfected the mobile siege train, dragging massive bombards that can shatter medieval walls in hours rather than weeks. We hear the thunder of these guns echoing across the valley of the Seine, a new sound that signals the obsolescence of the English defence. The castles built by Richard the Lionheart and strengthened by Henry the Fifth are helpless against these iron monsters. The stone does not stand, it splinters. The English commanders are fighting a 14th century war against a 15th century weapon, and the result is a massacre of masonry. We feel the ground shake as the walls of Harfleur come down, the dust choking the air, blinding the archers who try to return fire with arrows that simply bounce off the French shields. The asymmetry is total. The English have courage, but the French have physics. By the summer of 1450, it is over. The Battle of Formigny is the final bloody punctuation mark, a chaotic skirmish where an English relief army, sent as a last desperate hope, is cut to pieces, not by knights, but by two culverins, small cannons, that provoke them into a rash charge, followed by a flank attack from the Breton cavalry. We see the English dead lying in the tall grass, 4,000 men who died trying to save a corpse. The rest of Normandy falls in a cascade of surrender. Caen, the centre of English administration, the home of the university Bedford founded, opens its gates. The administrative papers, the tax rolls, the land deeds, the entire paper brain of the occupation are burned or used to wrap fish in the market. 30 years of governance are erased in 30 days. We stand on the cliffs of Cherbourg, looking north across the grey, turbulent channel. The last ship has sailed. Behind us, the lilies of France fly from every tower, from Mont Saint-Michel to the Vexin. The silence that settles over the province is profound. It is the silence of a returning owner who walks through his house after the squatters have gone, checking the damage, opening the windows to let out the stale air of foreign rule. Normandy is French again, and it feels as though the English were never there, their presence reduced to a few ruined walls and the bitter memories of the old. The empire has shrunk back to the island, but the island is not ready to receive the shock. The soldiers returning to England bring with them not glory, but anger, debt, and the dangerous habit of violence, carrying the seeds of the civil war that will soon tear their own country apart. The Channel is no longer a highway for English ambition. It is once again a moat, wide, cold, and impassable. The scent of the war changes now. For 100 years, the air above the battlefields of France has smelled of wet wool, horse sweat, and the coppery tang of spilled blood, the organic, intimate odours of men killing men at arm's length. But as we drift into the 6 or the early 1450s, a new acrid perfume begins to drift across the valleys of the Dordogne and the Seine, a sharp, stinging stench of sulphur and burnt charcoal that clings to the back of the throat and tastes like the devil's own breath. We are witnessing the birth of the gunpowder age, a transition that is not just technological but profoundly economic, turning the chaotic art of feudal warfare into a cold industrial science. The architects of this new world are not great lords or knights of the Garter, but two brothers from the bourgeoisie, Jean and Gaspard Bureau. They are not warriors in the traditional sense. They are administrators, technicians, men who look at a castle wall and see not a monument of honour, but a physics problem to be solved with iron and fire. We watch them in a muddy field outside a doomed English garrison, directing the placement of their great serpents, the massive bombards and sleek culverins that sit heavily in the earth, their bronze barrels dull and menacing under the grey sky. There is a terrifying calmness to their work. They check the elevation with quadrants, they measure the powder charges with precise scales, and they consult little notebooks filled with ballistic calculations. It is the arrival of the specialist, the engineer who kills from a distance without ever drawing a sword. To the English commander watching from the battlements, these machines represent a nightmare of obsolescence. He stands on walls that were built 2 centuries ago, thick masonry designed to withstand scaling ladders and trebuchets, but against the focused kinetic energy of an iron ball moving at the speed of sound, the stone is brittle as sugar. We feel the ground jump, a physical, concussive thud that travels through the soles of the boots and rattles the teeth as the first battery fires. It is not a roar, it is a crack, a tearing of the air itself, followed seconds later by the sickening crumble of impact. The cloud of white smoke billows out, blinding and choking, a fog of war that hides the destruction until the wind clears it to reveal a gaping wound in the tower. The economics of the siege have been inverted instantly. In the past, a castle was a force multiplier that allowed a small, cheap garrison to hold off a large, expensive army for months, starving the attacker's treasury. Now, the cannon is the force multiplier. It is expensive to build and expensive to feed with powder, yes, but it saves time. A siege that once took a year now takes a week. The Bureau brothers have turned time into money, and the French crown, with its steady tax revenue, can afford to buy the speed that breaks the English banks. We drift closer to the guns themselves, seeing the crews that serve them. These are not noble squires. They are grimy, blackened men, paid wages to haul heavy sacks of kraut, the mixture of saltpetre, sulphur and charcoal, and to swab the scorching barrels with wet sheepskins. They are the proletariat of war, men whose loyalty is to the payroll, not the heraldry. The supply chain required to keep these batteries firing is a marvel of the new French state. We imagine the carts trundling along the roads, laden not with arrows, but with stone shot hewn from quarries miles away, and barrels of powder imported from the trade networks of the East. It is a logistical web that requires a solvent government to maintain. England, broke and disorganised, cannot compete in this arms race. We see the few English guns in the garrison, rusted, outdated, with little powder to spare, firing sporadically and inaccurately. It is like watching a cottage industry try to fight a factory. The mystery of the gun is a jealously guarded secret, a guild knowledge that the French have mastered and the English have neglected. The English still worship the longbow, the weapon of the yeoman, the hero's tool. But the longbow takes a lifetime to master. A culverin can be aimed by a mathematician and fired by a labourer, and it kills the longbowman just as dead. The psychological impact of this bombardment is shattering. Inside the walls, the constant rhythmic hammering drives men mad. There is no rhythm of day and night, only the random, terrifying arrival of death that smashes through roofs and floors, crushing sleepers in their beds. The old rules of sanctuary, of safe stone, are gone. We feel the dust settling in the hair and lungs of the defenders, a constant reminder that their protection is turning into their tomb. When the breach is finally practical, a ramp of rubble that allows the French men-at-arms to walk right into the fortress, the surrender comes quickly. The English captains realise that courage is useless against ballistics. They walk out of the ruins, their armour covered in the white dust of their failure, looking at the bronze guns, with a mixture of hatred and awe. They have been defeated by chemistry. The Bureau brothers do not even look up from their notebooks. They are already calculating the logistics for moving the train to the next target, treating the conquest of a province as a series of work orders to be completed. As we drift away from the smoking ruin, the landscape itself seems changed. The romantic silhouette of the castle, the symbol of feudal power, has been rendered fragile, temporary. The noise of the bombardment fades, but the smell remains, hanging in the valleys. The smell of the modern era arriving. It is a scent that signals the end of the age of individual heroism. The knight in shining armour, the devastating charge, the duel of champions, all of it is being rendered secondary to the cold equation of mass times velocity. The war has become a rich man's game, a contest of industrial capacity where the king with the most foundries wins. England, bankrupt and clinging to the past, is bringing a knife to a gunfight. The smoke drifts across the channel, a warning that the island is no longer safe behind its wooden walls. For the Age of Iron has no respect for the moat, and the bill for this progress is one that the House of Lancaster can no longer afford to pay. The sun sets through the haze, turning the sky a bruised, angry purple, and the silence that follows is not peace, but the ringing in the ears of a world that has just been deafened by its own future. We drift far to the south now, leaving the cold, shattered stone of Normandy for a land of golden light and warm, heavy air, where the Garonne River widens lazily towards the sea and the hills are combed with the endless green geometry of vineyards. This is Gascony, the ancient duchy of Aquitaine, and for 300 years, longer than the United States has existed, it has been the sun-drenched garden of the English crown. The relationship here is not one of occupier and occupied, but of customer and merchant, a marriage built not on the sword, but on the wine barrel. The air smells of crushed grapes, salt water, and the dry, dusty heat of the southern summer. A sensory world that feels utterly divorced from the grey fogs of London. Yet the two are linked by an invisible highway of commerce that is older than living memory. We wander the wharves of Bordeaux, the great port city that turns its back to France and looks toward the ocean, and we see the ghosts of a prosperity that is fading. For centuries, the vintage fleet would arrive here every autumn, hundreds of English ships bobbing in the harbour, waiting to be loaded with the claret, the clear red wine that warmed the bellies of English kings, poets, and ploughmen alike. It was a trade that made Bordeaux rich and kept the English treasury afloat with customs duties, a perfect circle of liquid gold. But now, in the early 1450s, the wharves are quiet. The ships are few, their hulls peeling in the sun, and the warehouses are half empty. The war has finally come to the vineyard, and it is souring the vintage. The French army, led by the efficient Count of Dunois, descends upon the region in 1451, not with a roar of destruction, but with the suffocating weight of inevitability. They are here to reclaim a land that does not particularly want to be reclaimed. We feel the tension in the streets of the city, where the merchants speak Gascon, a language neither French nor English, and look at the lilies of France with deep suspicion. To them, Paris is a distant, greedy landlord who wants to tax their profits, while London is the distant, thirsty friend who buys their product. When the French take the city, the reality of the recouvrance hits the Gascons in the wallet. The new French tax collectors arrive before the dust has settled, their ledgers open, demanding the tile, the salt tax, the heavy levies that support Charles VII's standing army. The Gascons, used to the light touch of the English kings who were desperate for their loyalty, are horrified. The romance of reunion with the French motherland evaporates the moment the first tax bill arrives. We sense a shift in the atmosphere, a quiet, desperate rebellion brewing, not among the knights, but among the burghers and the mayors. They send secret messengers slipping out of the harbour at night, small, fast boats dodging the French blockade, carrying letters to London. The message is simple and heartbreaking. Come back, we will open the gates. It is a plea from a people who feel they are being strangled by the modern state, begging for the return of the old, chaotic, feudal freedom. And in London, the English crown, despite its bankruptcy, despite its exhaustion, listens. It is the last gasp of the empire, a reflex action of a dying beast. They scrape together one final expeditionary force, not a massive army of conquest, but a small, potent core of veterans. And to lead them, they drag out of retirement the only man who still remembers how to win, John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury. We see him standing on the deck of his flagship, a figure of almost mythical proportions, over 80 years old, an age that is practically immortal in this era. He is the English Achilles, a living relic of the days of Henry V, a man who fights without armour because he has sworn an oath, or perhaps because at his age the plate is too heavy. He wears a crimson velvet cap, a flash of defiant colour against the grey sea. When Talbot lands in Gascony in October 1452, the impossible happens. The history books tell us the war is over, but here it flares up with a sudden blinding brightness. The Gascons rise. The gates of Bordeaux are thrown open. The French garrisons are chased out not by English arrows, but by angry mobs of winemakers and coopers. It is a restoration that feels like a dream, a return to the good old days of free trade and low taxes. For a brief winter, it seems as though the clock has been turned back, that the Angevin Empire has risen from the grave. But we, watching from the drifting perspective of deep time, can see the fragility of this moment. It is an Indian summer of false warmth before the true winter sets in. The English have returned, but they have brought no money. Talbot is ruling on credit, on the goodwill of the locals, and on the promise of a victory that he cannot afford to buy. The wine trade that they are fighting to save is already withering on the vine. The markets in England have been disrupted by the chaos. The supply chains are broken. We walk through the vineyards in the spring of 1453, where the vines are putting out new shoots, unaware that the ground beneath them is about to be trampled by the largest French army ever assembled. Charles VII is not panicked by Talbot's return. He is annoyed. He treats it as a revolt to be crushed, an administrative error to be corrected with maximum prejudice. He mobilizes the entire machinery of the state, the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, the thousands of archers, and most importantly, the Bureau brothers with their 300 cannons. The French army moves south like a glacier, slow, heavy, and unstoppable, grinding everything in its path. The contrast is painful. On one side, an 80-year-old hero and a militia of enthusiastic merchants fighting for a memory. On the other, a fully funded, professional military-industrial complex fighting for the future. The silence of the ocean to the west feels vast and indifferent. The ships that used to crowd the horizon are gone, leaving the sea empty, a blank canvas where the English hope used to be. The connection is being severed, not just politically, but economically. The deep England that existed in the south of France, the England of Eleanor of Aquitaine, of troubadours and spiced wine, is dying. It is being strangled by the new borders of the nation-state, which demand that a man must be either French or English, and can no longer be a Gascon merchant who sells to whoever pays the best price. The wind rustles the dry leaves of the previous year's vintage, a sound like whispering paper, the whispering of unpaid bills, of voided contracts, of treaties that have expired. Talbot stands in Bordeaux, looking east, knowing that the French are coming, and perhaps knowing too that he is the last of his kind, a dinosaur facing a meteor. He represents a style of war and a style of governance that is personal, based on honour and relationships. The enemy approaching him is impersonal, based on ballistics and taxation. And the tragedy of Gascony is that it wants to stay in the past, in the loose, comfortable, chaotic embrace of the English crown. But the future is marching down the valley of the Dordogne, dragging heavy bronze guns that care nothing for the price of wine or the loyalty of kings. The sun sets over the Atlantic, painting the water the colour of dark wine, a libation poured out for the end of an age, as the darkness gathers around the last English foothold on the continent, preparing it for the final thunderous lesson in the cost of fighting forever. The morning of July 17th, 1453, dawns hot and breathless over the valley of the Dordogne, the air thick with the buzzing of insects and the heavy, sweet scent of river mud baking in the summer sun, a sensory stillness that belies the violence gathering on the horizon. We drift above the French encampment near the town of Castillon, and what we see is not a battlefield in the traditional sense, but an industrial slaughterhouse designed by engineers. The French army has not formed a line of battle with knights and banners fluttering in the wind. Instead, they have dug themselves into the earth, creating a massive fortified enclosure and artillery park. The Bureau brothers have laid out this position with the precision of architects, surrounding their camp with a jagged ditch and a rampart of earth reinforced with tree trunks. Behind this wall, peering out like dark, unblinking eyes, sit 300 cannons, their muzzles trained on the open field across which any attacker must pass. It is a trap, cold and mathematical, a killing box that waits patiently for the enemy to step inside. We feel the tension in the French gunners, men who are sweating in their leathers, holding the linstocks, the slow-burning matches, hovering inches above the touch holes of their weapons. They are not waiting for a signal of honour. They are waiting for a calculation of range. On the other side of the ridge, in the town of Castillon, John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, hears mass. He is impatient, his blood stirred by reports that the French are retreating, a fatal piece of intelligence that is, in fact, a mirage caused by the dust of camp followers leaving the French lines. Talbot is a man of the previous century, a warrior who believes in the shock of the charge and the morale of the brave, and he cannot conceive that his enemy would simply sit in a hole and wait for him. He orders the advance, not waiting for his own artillery, not waiting for his full infantry support. He rides out with his cavalry, a splendid glittering wave of horsemen, the last true charge of the Middle Ages, rushing headlong into the future. We watch the collision of these two worlds with a sense of tragic inevitability. The English knights thunder across the plain, shouting, "Talbot, St. George," their lances lowered, a terrifying display of kinetic energy that would have shattered any army at Crécy or Poitiers. But as they approach the earthworks, the world explodes. The French guns fire in a rolling, continuous volley, a sound so loud it is felt in the chest before it is heard in the ears, a man-made thunder that drowns out the prayers and the war cries. We see the smoke billow out, a thick white curtain that instantly obscures the sun, turning the bright July morning into a choking grey twilight. The effect on the English column is catastrophic. The cannonballs do not just kill individuals, they tear through files of men and horses, ploughing bloody furrows through the mass of the charge. It is not a battle, it is a liquidation. The chivalric code, which relies on the ability to close with the enemy and fight him hand to hand, is rendered instantly null and void. The English are dying, before they can even see the faces of the men killing them. We glimpse Talbot himself, the old lion, riding through the smoke, his horse frantic with terror. He is wearing a purple surcoat, easily identifiable, a target for every gunner. He urges his men forward, trying to bridge the gap, trying to turn this massacre back into a fight. But the geometry of the battlefield is against him. The French archers, protected by the ramparts, add their arrows to the storm, a hail of wood and iron that falls into the confusion of the English retreat. The tragedy reaches its climax when Talbot's horse is struck by a culverin shot, collapsing and pinning the 80-year-old general beneath its weight. He lies there in the dust, trapped, the symbol of English martial pride rendered helpless. In the old days, a knight of his stature would have been taken prisoner, ransomed for a fortune, treated with wine and respect in the tent of the victor. But this is the new war. A French archer, or perhaps a camp follower, history is unsure, and the anonymity is part of the horror, approaches the fallen lord. He does not ask for surrender. He raises a battle axe and brings it down. The English Achilles dies not in a duel of champions, but in the dirt, killed by a nobody, his identity erased by the brutality of the melee. With his death, the spirit of the army breaks. The English turn and flee, chased by the French cavalry, who now emerge from the smoke like wolves. But the pursuit is almost unnecessary. The lesson has been delivered. The survivors scatter into the vineyards and the forests, leaving the field to the flies and the looters. We drift over the silence that follows, a silence that feels heavier than the noise. The guns cool, ticking as the metal contracts, the smoke drifting lazily towards the river, carrying the smell of sulphur and death. The Battle of Castillon is over, and with it, the 100 Years' War. There is no treaty signed on the field, no grand ceremony of peace, just the grim reality that the English have no army left to field. The news travels back to Bordeaux, and the city, which had opened its arms to Talbot only months before, now closes its shutters in fear. They know there is no one coming to save them. The siege that follows is a formality, a slow starvation that ends in October when the city surrenders to Charles VII for the second and final time. This time, the terms are harsh. The leaders of the rebellion are banished. The city is fined a crushing sum, and the English, all of them, the merchants, the soldiers, the administrators, are told to leave. We stand on the docks of the Garonne one last time, watching the ships being loaded. It is a scene of final, absolute severance. The crates of wine, the chests of wool, the personal belongings of families who have lived here for 3 centuries, all of it is packed away. The English are not just losing a province, they are losing a part of their identity. For 300 years, to be English was to be partly French, to have one foot on the island and one foot on the continent, to drink claret and speak a courtly dialect of French. Now, as the sails are hoisted and the ships turn their prows towards the grey Atlantic, that dual nature is severed. They are becoming islanders, trapped by the sea, forced to look inward. The continental dream that began with William the Conqueror and reached its zenith with Henry VI has ended in the mud of Castillon. We feel the widening of the distance between the two nations, the channel becoming a psychological abyss. France turns its back on the ocean, looking inward to consolidate its power, becoming a land power, a centralized state. England sails away, bruised, bankrupt, and angry, carrying the trauma of the defeat back to its own shores. The soldiers who return are not heroes, they are unemployed killers, men who have known nothing but war and who now find themselves in a country that is too poor to pay them and too weak to control them. The violence they learned in the chevauchée of France does not evaporate. It travels with them, seeping into the liveries of the English barons, preparing the soil for the Wars of the Roses. The thunder at Castillon was the death knell of the English Empire, but its echo will shatter the peace of England for another 30 years. As the last ship disappears over the horizon, the sun sets on the Middle Ages, and the modern world, cold, efficient, and expensive, begins to rise in the east, built on the foundations of debt, gunpowder, and the absolute power of the king. The grey water of the English Channel churns against the hulls of the transport ships docking at Rye and Winchelsea, carrying a cargo far more dangerous than the plague rats of the previous century. We stand on the wet, slippery cobblestones of the harbour, watching the gangplanks descend, and we witness the return of the English, a homecoming that is devoid of streamers, trumpets, or gratitude. These men stumbling onto the shore are not the fresh-faced yeomen who sailed out with Henry V to win a kingdom. They are the wreckage of that dream, hardened survivors with scarred faces and empty purses, men who have spent their entire adult lives in a land that was legally theirs but physically hostile. They carry their possessions in bundles of oilcloth, rusted sallets, dented breastplates, perhaps a few looted silver spoons hidden in a boot, but their heaviest burden is invisible. They bring the war home with them. We smell the stale odour of wet wool and unwashed bodies, the scent of an army that has dissolved into a mob. There is a profound, unsettled quiet in the town as they pass through. The shopkeepers lock their shutters. The tavern owners hide their best casks. These soldiers are not seen as protectors anymore. They are seen as locusts returning to a field that has already been eaten bare. They are masterless men, a terrifying legal category in the 15th century, drifting professionals who know only one trade, violence, in an economy that has no use for it. We drift with them along the muddy roads of Kent and Sussex, moving inland towards a capital that wishes they would simply disappear. The England they return to is not the wealthy island of legend. It is a country hollowed out by the same financial rot that destroyed the empire in France. The great slump has turned the villages grey and silent. There is no work. The wool trade is stagnant. The fields are untilled because the labour is too expensive, and the coin is so scarce that men barter with eggs and nails. We feel the frustration of the returning archer who walks into an alehouse, slapping a French coin on the counter, a denier stamped with a fleur-de-lis, only to be told it is worthless here. He is a man who was promised wages he never received, fighting a war his king could not afford, and now he finds that his service counts for nothing. The anger that fueled the chevauchés in Normandy, the sanctioned burning and looting of French peasants, does not simply evaporate because they have crossed a body of water. It turns inward. We begin to see the symptoms of the infection, a sudden rise in highway robbery, local disputes settled with a brutal efficiency that shocks the magistrates, and the terrifying realization that the king's peace is a fiction. The habit of war has stained the soul of the nation. We move to the great estates of the north and the west, to the castles of the powerful magnates, the Dukes of York, the Earls of Warwick, the Salisburys. Here, the drifting men find a new home, but at a terrible price for the stability of the realm. We watch a line of veterans queuing in a courtyard, not to sign up for the King's Army, which no longer exists, but to take the livery of a local lord. They are given a badge, a bare and ragged staff, a white rose, a red rose, a knot, and a small stipend. In exchange, they become the private muscle of a feudal warlord. This is the era of bastard feudalism, a term historians use to describe the corruption of the old loyalty. It is no longer about land and duty. It is about cash and protection. We feel the sinister shift in the atmosphere of the English countryside. The law courts are paralysed because juries are intimidated by gangs of men wearing the livery of the defendant's lord. If a duke wants a neighbour's land, he does not sue. He sends 300 unemployed archers to camp on the lawn. The state has fractured into competing syndicates, each armed with the debris of the French war. We drift through the corridors of Westminster, where the vacuum of power is palpable. King Henry VI is physically present, a tall, gentle man who wanders the halls in simple clothes, but mentally he is absent, lost in a catatonic stupor that leaves him staring at the walls for hours, unable to speak or recognize his own son. It is a tragedy of biological timing. At the exact moment England needs a ruthlessly competent administrator to manage the influx of angry soldiers and the crushing debt, it has a saintly void. The council chamber is a shark tank. We see the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, fighting desperately to hold the centre, her voice sharp with panic, but she is a polarising figure, hated for her French origins and her refusal to compromise. The lords around the table, York and Somerset, are shouting, their hands resting on the pommels of their daggers. They are not debating policy, they are measuring each other's strength, calculating how many of those drifting veterans they have on their payroll. The politics of the debt has become the politics of the sword. The Crown owes so much money to York, for example, wages he paid out of his own pocket while commanding in France, that the only way he can get his money back is to take the government. The bankruptcy of the 100 Years' War is the direct engine of the Civil War. The atmosphere in London is thick with paranoia. The city gates are guarded not by the king's men, but by the militia of the guilds. Shopkeepers terrified of the soldiers camped in the suburbs. We sense the impending storm in the way people walk, heads down, avoiding eye contact. There is a dark, ironic humour in the fact that the English spent a century trying to destroy France, only to succeed in importing the chaos of France to their own island. The free companies that ravaged the Loire are now the retinues ravaging the Midlands. We witness a skirmish in a muddy street, a brawl between the men of Somerset and the men of York, swords drawn over a spilled tankard or a wrong look. It is a microcosm of what is coming. The blood spills into the gutter, mixing with the rain, indistinguishable from the blood shed at Agincourt or Castillon, but this blood buys no glory. It only buys retribution. As the year 1455 approaches, the tension stretches to the breaking point. The drifting men have found their masters, the lines are drawn, and the Wars of the Roses are ready to begin, not as a flower-strewn romance, but as a brutal gang war fought by unemployed contractors. We leave the darkened streets of London, where the fog acts as a blindfold for a blinded justice, and we feel a deep melancholic realization. The war in France bankrupted the king, but the peace in England is about to bankrupt the soul of the country. The soldiers who walked home from the coast didn't just bring their armour, they brought the silence of the grave, and they are about to spread it across the green and pleasant land. The long, expensive dream of empire has officially ended, but the nightmare of the bill collector is just getting started. We drift finally to a quiet room in a tower, perhaps in the late 15th century, where the dust motes dance in shafts of sunlight that fall across shelves stacked high with rolls of parchment. The noise of the cannons at Castillon has faded into history, and the shouts of the drifting soldiers in England have been swallowed by the silence of the years. We are left with the silence of the archive, the only place where the war truly continues to live. We look at two maps laid side by side on a table, and in the stark difference between them, we see the final balance sheet of the 100 Years' War. On the left is the map of France. It has changed from a patchwork quilt of feudal colours, a chaotic jumble of semi-independent duchies and foreign claims, into a single solid block of royal blue. The war, which was meant to break the French monarchy, has instead forged it into something harder than steel. We see the legacy of Charles VII and his son, Louis XV, the Spider King, who used the standing army and the permanent tax system born of emergency to crush the remaining independent lords. The state here has become absolute, a centralised machine that runs on the twin fuels of gunpowder and revenue, efficient, ruthless, and terrifyingly modern. The King of France is no longer a feudal overlord asking for help. He is the emperor in his own kingdom, his power unchecked by the local nobility who were bled dry by the conflict. The war bankrupted the old medieval order, but it capitalised the new absolute monarchy. On the right is the map of England. It is smaller now, shrunk back to the island, with only the tiny, stubborn dot of Calais remaining on the French coast as a memory of the empire that was. But the change here is internal. The bankruptcy of the Crown, the reliance on Parliament for every penny of war funding, has created a different kind of beast. The English king is not absolute. He is constrained, forced to bargain with his subjects, forced to explain his debts. The chaos of the civil wars, the Wars of the Roses, will eventually burn itself out, leaving a nation that is suspicious of standing armies, suspicious of continental entanglements, and fiercely protective of its own island liberties. The war has defined what it means to be English, not by what they conquered, but by what they lost. They are no longer part French. They are something distinct, separate, defined by the sea and the language that developed in opposition to the enemy. We feel the weight of the identities that have crystallized in the crucible of the debt. Before the war, a noble might have asked, "Who is my lord?" Now, a man asks, "What is my country?" The ledger of the two kingdoms is closed. The cost was astronomical. Millions of coins, hundreds of thousands of lives, the burning of entire provinces. But the purchase was the modern world. The war that bankrupted kings did not just empty treasuries, it emptied the world of the Middle Ages. It destroyed the idea that a king could own a country like a private estate, and replaced it with the idea of the nation, a terrifyingly expensive, immortal entity that demands the blood and gold of its citizens in perpetuity. We see the ghosts of the players drifting through the room. Edward III, the Black Prince, Henry V, Joan of Arc, Bedford, Talbot. And they seem small now, figures in a tapestry that is fading in the light of the new era. They fought for crowns and claims, but they built bureaucracies and borders. And the irony is the final quiet note of the story. The English lost the war for France, but in losing it, they found England. The French suffered the war in their own home, but in suffering it, they built France. The bankruptcy was the price of admission to the future. The sun begins to set outside the archive window, casting long shadows that merge the two maps into one grey blur. The accounts are settled. The loans have been written off. The 100 years are over, not because the hatred ended, but because the money ran out and the world moved on. The channel between the two nations is no longer a highway for kings, but a deep, cold moat that separates two different experiments in how to rule a people. The silence in the room is total, a peaceful, heavy stillness that marks the end of the long struggle. The quill is laid down, the ink is dry, and the story, which began with the thunder of knights, ends with the quiet closing of a book. The debt is paid, the past is fixed, and the kings, rich and poor, victorious and defeated, are all sleeping now, wrapped in the gold and the silence of history. The time slows now, the heavy golden dust of the archive settling on the floor, covering the maps and the memories in a soft, protective layer of quiet. The voices of the captains and the kings drift away, becoming no louder than the wind in the trees outside, a gentle, rhythmic hushing that smooths the edges of the old anger. The story is no longer a sequence of battles, but a single long exhale, a releasing of tension that has been held for centuries. We feel the darkness of the night wrapping around the tower, not as a threat, but as a warm, heavy blanket, turning the pages of the past into the dreams of the present. The stone walls that once rang with the sound of iron now hold only the warmth of the day, radiating a slow, steady comfort. The borders have dissolved in the dark, the debts are forgotten in the sleep. There is nothing left to count, nothing left to conquer, only the deep, vast ocean of time that holds us all, safe and still. The candle flickers and goes out, leaving only the starlight to watch over the resting world. Sweet dreams,